Hello everyone, welcome to our module video on Module 7 for our lecture video. Here we'll be talking about organizing our speech, and I know a lot of you also had this as your goal for what you wanted to improve upon from your introduction speech, and also just an overall goal you had for the semester. So here we're really going to break down the different components of the speech. Really important to note is in this module I have linked a outline template. So once you review this information and understand what goes in each section of that template, feel free to use that for the remainder of your speeches, and you can fill it out. Please use full sentences, but you don't have to write a manuscript. Remember, we're aiming to speak conversationally and extemporaneously, but speaking from an outline is exactly how you do that effectively. So, with that being said, we can go ahead and jump in and talk about the components of the speech that we use. Now this is, I just want to say, a really basic speech structure that will really help your audience follow the flow of your speech, and it does incorporate three main parts, the introduction, the body, and the conclusion, and we're very specific about what you include in each of those sections, so I will go through that. But first we're going to start with the introduction, and obviously the purpose of an introduction is to introduce the audience to what you're speaking about. You definitely want to hook the audience in just like you do in an essay. It establishes the purpose of your speech, and in here you will state your thesis. And again, you tell the listeners what they're going to hear. So a very cool way to remember this is when you're speaking, again, repetition is key. So first you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, then you're going to tell them, and then you're going to tell them what you told them. So that's just a fun little way to remember repetition and the importance of repetition in a speech. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, next is the body, which just presents your main points. And we use a standard of 3 main points, as you'll see on the outline. Those can go in chronological order, they can be topical, and we will talk about that a little bit later. But under your main points are those supporting points, which we talked about in a previous module about supporting material, and that's what goes under your main point, is the supporting material. And finally, we have our conclusion. So this is where the part where you tell the audience what you had told them already. So you summarize your main points, you restate those very clearly, you reiterate your thesis and your purpose, and you challenge the audience to respond or have a strong closing statement. So going into what the main points should be is the main points really should express your key ideas of the speech. Spend a lot of time developing out these main points to make sure that you're using equally strong main points throughout your speech. You don't want one main point to have a lot of supporting material underneath it, and then your 2 remaining main points to be really weak with supporting material, because that's not a balanced speech. So try and come up with and structure main points that can have equal weights attached to them with their supporting material. So they express key ideas and major themes of your speech. They have to, again, be mutually exclusive from each other, so make sure that we can actually distinguish the difference between those main points, and it's not just one giant point that you're trying to make. They need to be stated as a declarative sentence in parallel form. So again, we'll talk about transition statements, but the parallel form just means that you state them the same way. So this just means, like, first I'm going to talk to you about X, and you state your main point, and make sure they're all in a single declarative sentence. And make sure they always fall under the umbrella of your thesis statement. Again, if it doesn't relate back to your thesis, it does not belong as a main point. So your supporting points, again, we talked about this in supporting material, so I'm going to kind of breeze past this. But this is just where you organize the evidence you have gathered. Make sure that you use different kinds of evidence that appeal to all logos, ethos, and pathos. Make sure you're trying to incorporate all different kinds of these. If you use all statistics and all logos appeals, that is not going to be as effective as incorporating different kinds of supporting materials like we talked about. So try and include different things like narratives or expert testimonies, and some facts and statistics to help you really appeal to different things within your speech. So again, you want to strive, like I said, for unified, coherent, and balanced organization. So make sure that, again, I'm going to say this a million times, but the speech contains only points that implied by the purpose and thesis statement. So again, make sure you have your thesis statement and then your main points under that, and make sure the supporting points relate back to only that main point, and the main point relates back to your thesis. So make sure you have clear and logical organization. So structure your main points in a way that, again, makes sense. They can be topical, so you can go from one topic to another, again, all relating back to the same thesis. They can be chronological, so you can go in an order. So again, for instance, in your introduction speeches, if you were going to use this outline template and have 3 main points, you could tell 3 different parts of the story. So first, I'm going to tell you about this aspect of the story. Next, I'm going to tell you how it impacted me. And finally, I'm going to tell you how it's helped me learn and project towards the future. So that's just an example of how you can do that chronologically. Balance, again, like I said, I already mentioned this, but appropriate emphasis or weight is given to each part of the speech. So don't put one main point, all the supporting points under one main point, and then make your other main points weak. Transitions. Transitions are very important for a speech, because if you do not include clear transitions, it will be very hard for your audience to follow you. So these are words and phrases that tie the speech ideas together, and they should occur a lot of different places. Make sure you have a transition between the introduction and your body so that we know you're going into your main points now. Make sure you have it between the main points within the body of the speech. And finally, you need to transition from the body of the speech to your conclusion. So transition words really include things like, next, I'm going to tell you about my next main point, blah, 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 blah. So, and again, a transition statement from the introduction to the body might be something like, now that I have told you about the 3 main points, let's dive in. First, and then use those words first, second, lastly. Those are really, really distinctive. And even especially in a mediated space, we use things called signposting. So that's really helpful to your audience in a lot of different spaces. So signposting really just means that you use gestures to indicate you're moving on to the next part of the speech. So you can say, first, I'm going to tell you about mediated communication. Next, I'm going to tell you about the communication model. And finally, I'm going to tell you about transition words. Those obviously don't fall under the same category, but those are the first things I thought of to give you an example of signposting. All right. So introduction components. So there are 5 components to the introduction, and I almost guarantee that this will be a quiz question. So make sure you know these. A quiz question for some of you. I know that they're a little bit different, but make sure that you include, we'll go through the specifics of each of these, but first your attention-getting device, your thesis statement, your credibility statement, preview of your main points, and the transition to the body. So we will go through all of these specifically, but really important to remember is that they do need to go in this order. Again, we want to keep it really structured so that when you leave this class, you at least have an idea of one way to keep your speech very structured. So first, you want to gain your audience attention. I do want to note that there is a file in this module called Introduction and Conclusion Components that goes into more depth and examples of what to include for, say, your attention getter and things like that. So make sure you check out that file. I'm sure, hopefully you already have or you will, to really get an idea more in depth about how we want to do these. So the first thing you want to say to your audience is not, hi, my name is Meredith, because that won't necessarily hook your audience in. You don't need to introduce yourself in this class any further since we do know each other. In the future, it's good to maybe introduce yourself if you're giving a presentation elsewhere, but immediately after that, you want to jump into an attention getter. So, methods of winning the audience's attention, you could tell a brief story, you could establish common ground. A lot of people use humor to tell a joke to hook the audience in. A really good way to hook the audience in is using a really jarring statistic. So, maybe if you were talking about childhood obesity, for example, you would say, this is incorrect, so don't get on me for this, but 65% of American children struggle with obesity. And then that would be a really good way to establish what you're going to talk about, but it also draws the audience in, like, wow, that's a real problem. I should probably listen to that speech. Another good way is to use a quotation. So again, if I was starting a speech, I would immediately start off with a quote. So you don't need to introduce the quote. You just start saying the quote, and then you can say who the quote is by at the end. So again, this is supposed to be really striking, really strong, and really hook the audience in and establish your confidence as a speaker. Another great way that a lot of students I had in the past have used this is they ask a question. So this might be harder in a mediated space, but if you wanted to take a poll, that would be a good intro attention getter. Also, you could say, how many of you all have struggled with eating fast food and only fast food on campus? And then you'd have students raise their hand who have dealt with that. So that's getting the audience involved also, and that's a good option for an attention getter. Next, you transition to your thesis statement. Again, you don't need a transition word between these. We will know it's your thesis statement because it'll be your most declarative sentence immediately after your attention getter. So again, this is basically your topic sentence for the whole speech. So we talked about developing a thesis, so I hope you've reviewed that information, but it should be a single declarative sentence that expresses what the speech will attempt to demonstrate or prove. So again, this is not your purpose statement. Your purpose statement is for you. This is for your audience so that they know what you're going to be talking about in your speech. Some of you included this in your introduction speeches, and some of you did not, which is okay because we hadn't talked about it yet. But telling us what your speech is going to be about is really important so we don't have to try and figure it out along the way. That makes audiences work too hard and then they lose interest. So make sure you're very clear up front with your thesis statement and what you're going to talk about. Next, you want to establish your credibility as a speaker. Again, this can be really overt. You can say, I am credible to talk about this topic because I majored in communication studies and I have been teaching public speaking for a long time. That would be a good sentence that establishes your credibility as a speaker. And no matter what you're talking about, again, for your briefing speech, that will hopefully be something that you are very comfortable knowing about because you will be briefing or informing us about that topic. So just talk about your qualifications, even if it's I'm qualified to talk about because I have done extensive research on the subject and am confident in my ability to convey to you what I've learned. That's a good way to establish credibility to your audience because we know that you've done more research than we have as audience members about your topic. Next is you want to preview your main points. This is also really important, and this is where that signposting I talked about comes into play. So this helps the listeners mentally organize your speech. So this is where you, again, very overtly and very specifically list your main points in the introduction. So after you've gone through your attention getter, your thesis statement, and your credibility statement, you want to preview the main points. So you'll say, after you've done your credibility statement, you'll say, first, I will talk to you about previewing the main points. Next, I will talk to you about conclusion components. And finally, I will talk to you about Module 7. Again, that's, a random example. But that helps you give an idea of previewing your main points. You need to make sure you've obviously established your main points before working on this section. But again, that's just one sentence that gives us a summary of what you're going to talk about. Really important is that please do not conflate your thesis statement with your main points. Your thesis statement needs to be overarching and engulf all of those main points, but they should not be the same sentence or anywhere near the same sentence. So if I was talking about childhood obesity, for instance, I would develop a thesis statement that talks about the problems of childhood obesity, and then my main points might be, first, I'm going to talk to you about the history of childhood obesity. Next, I'm going to provide some evidence of why it's a problem. And finally, I'm going to talk about what you can do to combat childhood obesity. So again, those are different sentences, and you need to make sure that they are distinct and not conflated or the same. And make sure, again, you state your main points in the order that you're going to be stating them in your speech, because that can get really confusing. Remember, you're trying to be very clear to your audience about what you're going to say and the order in which you're going to say it. So finally is preparing the conclusion. So you notice it didn't include the number 5, which is transition to your main points and the body of your speech. You do need to include that after you preview the main points. You say, so now that I've told you I've introduced my 3 main points, let's jump in first, and then you can start your first main point. And again, you don't have to say it the exact same way I'm saying it. Just make sure that you incorporate all of these components into your speech to make sure it's clear and organized. So finally, again, when you're preparing the conclusion, conclusions, again, serve to signal the end of your speech. So we should be able to tell when you're wrapping up, remember, because you're transitioning to your conclusion. It summarizes your key points. We'll go into this, but you will be restating your 3 main points that you have previewed for us. You reiterate the central idea by restating your thesis. You challenge the audience to respond, especially in a persuasive speech. And you end the speech memorably and strong. So again, signal the end of the speech with transition words and provide some closure. So use transitional words or phrases such as finally or in conclusion is my favorite because it definitely signals the conclusion of the speech and it's not cliche at all. Or you can say, let me close by saying, or today we have talked about, and that transitions to your review of your main points. So there are just some examples. You can adjust the manner of your delivery. You can slow down to signal the end of your speech. You can adjust your tone, pitch, rhythm, rate. This part is not as important to me, I do not think, because if you use really distinct transition words, you should be able to signal to the audience that you have organized a clear speech. This is just to really, again, emphasize and hone in on those rhetorical devices such as ethos, pathos, and logos. So if you want to have a more somber ending to your speech, if you've had a lot of really difficult information to present, you can again slow down, you could review, or you could do the opposite and you could get more intense and have a really strong call to action that we need to take action against this problem. Conclusion components, like I said, once you've transitioned, you need to restate your main points in the same order that you presented to them. So let's see. Yeah, we're going to go through those. And then you need to restate your thesis and your purpose. Again, you don't need to state your purpose out loud. This is just to make sure that you have accomplished your own purpose. Please just note that I can even, if you want to ignore this, whatever. Just restate your thesis really strong for the audience. And then a closing thought or call to action. Again, this needs to be very strong. So again, summarize, review your main points. So after you say, in conclusion, today I talked to you about the history of childhood obesity, the current contemporary problems that we're dealing with, and how we can combat them. That is just really helping us, okay, I remember what you talked about in those different sections. It brings the speech full circle and provides the audience with a sense of completion. You need to restate your thesis. Always restate your thesis. Again, repetition is so important when it comes to oral communication and public speaking, because we can't go back and read it. So we're going to have to remember the main points of your speech. And you don't even need to rewrite your thesis for the conclusion. I would even suggest you copy paste it from the introduction, because repetition is key and it will not sound repetitive to the audience. And then you need to state a closing thought or a call to action. That's what this says, is call to action. I can move this real quick. And informative speeches challenge listeners to use what they've learned. So you can say something really strong like, today I hope you've learned how we can combat childhood obesity, and here's what you can do. So again, close with something that is really strong and invites the audience to respond either intellectually or actively. Persuasive speeches challenge listeners to act in response to the speech, like I said, see the problem in a new way. So again, I hope this is maybe reframed how you see obesity, the obesity epidemic in America, and here's what you can do again, or something like that. And it can change their actions and beliefs. So remember we talked about it's really hard to change the audience's values, but actions and beliefs are easier to sway. So make sure that call to action is one of your strongest points in the speech next to your thesis statement. You can close with quotations, a really heartfelt story that, again, appeals to that pathos, that emotion of the audience. You can ask a question, a thought-provoking question that will send the audience home with. You can talk about a challenge that we now face together as a community, right? Or reference to the audience and occasion. So you can reference, we've all experienced the problems with childhood obesity. Hopefully today you've learned how we can take steps forward and unite under this problem to fight it. So something strong like that. Think very political, especially in persuasive speeches. You'll notice that politicians always tend to close with something really strong and a call to action for the audience. So again, this needs to be in the same order every time. You'll see that on your outline template. But basically, the way I think about it is the introduction goes from general to specific. So you start with your attention getter and then move down to your thesis and to your preview of your main points. So it looks like this, and your conclusion is going to look like this. So you review your main points, then you restate your thesis, and then you get broader and have a call to action. So it looks like an hourglass is a good way to think about that. So if you have any questions about this, there's a lot of material for you all to read for this module, because organization is a really important part of how we do our speeches, not only in this class, but if you don't have an organized speech, you will lose your audience very quickly, and it will sound rambly and not be interesting to the audience whatsoever. So please use that outline template. It's there for your benefit and ease. Take it with you when you download it, and take it with you when you leave this class. If you have any questions about organizing your speech, or if you want me to look over your outline, I would be happy to do so beforehand, before you need to turn that in. So thank you guys so much, and have a great rest of your day.